A recommendation by the National Coronavirus Command Council, the President and Cabinet and all those involved decided the country will remain on lockdown level 3 and not go to a harder lockdown level 4 or level 5 where we saw in the beginning of this lockdown. 120 days later, the country is now remaining on lockdown level 3 with some restrictions. Let's get reaction now from entrepreneur and business owner Vusi Thembekwayo joining us now on the line. Vusi, good evening and thank you for your time. 120 days in. By the way, I hope you're calm and you're not going to say anything that is going to get me into trouble. But quite seriously, though, the President and the National Coronavirus Command Council have decided 68,000 tavern owners will need to close, and there are some restaurants who've been saying they want on-site consumption. It seems that is not going to happen either, and those are businesses that would have otherwise been putting money into this economy, so likely going to see their doors closed. We don't know for how long.
I think, Thabo, first, thank you for having me, my brother. I really appreciate it. I think it's important to say that the President is in a very invidious position. It's not a position any of us would want to be in. It's admittedly a difficult position, but he's the man for the job and he's the one that's got to step up for this moment. You're right that there are businesses that are definitely going to be affected by this. And there are businesses that were hoping that they could come back and trade off the back of this, that it doesn't look that they'll be able to. I do think that there's still, great areas of inconsistency on this. And if those great areas of inconsistencies are not handled, we're going to have a big, big problem. So, for instance, people can go to parks, but families can't meet and gather. Things like that are going to become very problematic because people are just going together.
And people can sit together in a taxi that is 100% full, but they still can't go visit their parents.
Exactly. And I think, if we don't deal with those inconsistencies, and I think consistently since this lockdown has started, people have been saying there are inconsistencies. You need to deal with the inconsistencies. If you don't deal with the inconsistencies, then people are not going to adhere to the broader spirit of what they need to be doing. Now, of course, things like wear a mask, that's a non-negotiable. Keep social distancing, that's a non-negotiable. But if you've banned the sale of alcohol, that's understandable. You're not banning the sale of alcohol. What does that mean for the restaurant trade? The point that you make, right? The restaurant trade is aligned to the tourism sector. What does that mean for the tourism sector? All of those are questions that still remain unanswered. Let me just say one quick thing, Thabo, if you'll allow me. There would not be as much a hullabaloo about the President or the National Command Council's response to COVID if the economic stimulus was effective and was working. So if the 200 billion loan guarantee scheme that was made available at the banks had been dispersed, at last count, we were on 11 billion that's been dispersed into the economy. That's 5.5% in an economy that's shed hundreds of thousands of jobs since this lockdown has started. So and then issues of the UIF, people still the UIF months. If you don't deal with that, the other measures are not going to be.
Yeah. Vusi, part of what you do is also advise companies on strategy. And if you were to advise government right now on strategy to mobilize society to comply, what would be your advice?
Well, the first thing I would say to them is social equity is the single most important instrument in any form of public service. And right now, I think if you check the hashtags, the Twitters, the social medias, this government doesn't seem to have a lot of social equity. So I would say to them, go and win back your social equity. What does that mean? Go and convince people you're doing the right thing and you're doing it for them. That means you can't have things like a scooter program in the Eastern Cape. It means you can't have things like money being stolen out of the UIF and people then being hauled before the courts. As long as you have those things, people are not going to keep to the rule of law. So go and rebuild social equity. I'd say that's the single most important thing. The second thing I would say is you have to show people the data you're using to arrive at your conclusions. If you're not transparent with the data you're using to arrive at your conclusions, people aren't going to trust your conclusions. So, for instance, you reintroduce a curfew. Now, I'm presuming there's a reason behind the reintroduction of a curfew and how that affects the spread of the coronavirus. In other words, there must be an increase in the spread that happens after 9 o'clock. Otherwise, why are you reintroducing a curfew? So if you're not sharing the data behind the decisions you're making, people aren't going to trust those decisions. Those are the two most important things I would say to this government you have to do immediately.
Now, it seems this government is relying on the fact that it's saying to the people, look, we've saved lives. We look at our mortality rate is way lower than the global mortality rate. In fact, it's predicted that 40 to 50,000 people are going to die, but we can do better than that, and we have done. Our lockdown level 5 did really well. They're seemingly still relying on that. Is that enough to gain that social compact, that social equity from people?
No. The short answer is no. And the reason it's no is because, so let's extrapolate this, right? So by the president's own numbers, 40 to 50,000 people could lose their lives to coronavirus. But we heard at the beginning of this week, if not the middle of the week, that there are 1 million more people who've become unemployed because of this response. Now, I'm not in any way trying to compare a loss of a job to a loss of a life. I think those two things are incomparable. But the point I'm making is that if the quantum of the numbers doesn't seem to make sense, again, people are going to question the decisions that you're making. Let me very quickly make the point, Thabo, that in the description of any leader, in the job description of any leader is to be unpopular. If you're popular as a leader, you're probably not being effective. So I don't think that this government or this leadership cohort needs to be popular. But I do think it needs to be deliberate, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be consistent. I don't think there have been either of those things at the moment when it's mattered. So deliberate. If you say you're going to pump money into an economy, do it. You can't have a minister of finance who's saying, I'm going to come up with a third iteration of the economic stimulus plan. It's been 2-3 weeks later, we're still waiting. You need to be consistent. If you say to people, these are the things that we're going to do, then make sure those things are being done. And make sure they're being done even at the most local of levels. And then you need to deal with things like what we know is corruption. You can't have trucks arriving at houses of councillors delivering food parcels when the very community that you say you're serving is going hungry and people aren't getting their food. If you don't deal with those things on the ground, then you're always going to have an issue of people questioning your motive, questioning your initiatives, and most importantly, not adhering to the things you want them to do. Yeah. Again, it's an invidious position that the president is in. He's the man for the job.
Part of the strategy, of course, vital to it is contact tracing, and he emphasizes, and it should have been actually, we know that contact tracing is what worked in all the other countries that have managed to curb the spread of this virus earlier on, something that he's emphasizing will continue. But the other thing that he's saying, he's sending ministers and deputy ministers to districts so that they can ensure that intervention is happening at district level. What do you make of that?
Very interesting, and I'll tell you why. There are some of us who've been sitting on the sidelines over the past decade who've been saying that the most effective way to bring South Africa forward and to ensure service delivery is to remove provinces. And in effect, what the president has just done today is exactly that. Because by dispersing national government to district and local municipality level, in effect, he's overreached, if that's the correct word, or jumped the provincial process and gone directly to where the service delivery protest. It means that it's a subtle, if not a tacit admission by the president himself, that actually there needs to be a much broader, a much closer relationship between national government and local government with service delivery protests. Now, if it happens and it works, then I'm going to be very interested to see how they make an argument for the continuation of provinces after this, because it's pretty clear we might not need that middle layer of management in terms of our cooperative governance structure in South Africa.